It is 9:01 and we're going to start. Good morning to everyone on Zoom. It's wonderful to be back. It's wonderful to see everybody back in the auditorium. We have we've given you covers on your seats, so there's been an improvement here, and that way you know you're in Matan. So today's dedication, we'll start just with the dedication. Today's class is in memory of Greta Abelo on the occasion of her 8th yahrzeit by the Abelo and Tufaziner families. I'll just introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. I'm Yael Ziegler, and we're going to be learning this year the story of Yaakov's family, Yaakov's children. We're moving past our course of study from last year where we focused on Yaakov, and we're starting with the first story, which really focuses on the next generation, and that is the story of Dinah and Shem. It's not a happy story. It's a difficult story, both in terms of its subject matter and in terms of the moral dilemmas that it presents to the family of Yaakov and to us, the readers. We'll be talking about that a lot. In terms of the other dedication, we have spent 2 years dedicating our class, first of all, to the well-being of Am Yisrael. It's still dedicated to that, to the well-being of our courageous soldiers, definitely still dedicated to that, to the return of the hostages. And I do feel that, we're in a different place than we were when we last met. And every time, we would take breaks or even from one week to the next, but certainly when we would take any sort of break, Pesach break, Sukkot break, summer break, certainly I would say, when we meet again, we should have Bisarot Tovot, we should be in a better place. And even with saying that, I think it's really just an amazing thing that our live hostages are home, Be'ezrat Hashem. The Chalalim should all be home to get a proper burial as well. It's been a very difficult 2 years, and we've shared a lot of it together. Every single class, we opened with a Mizmor Tehillim that reflected at least my feelings on that day. Most of the time they were difficult Mizmor Tehillim. This morning, of course, we said Hallel, which is Kuf Yud Gimel through Kuf Yud Chet with a couple skips, which certainly reflects, I think, both our Shevach and Hodaya, but also our prayers for continued Hatzlacha, Ana Hashem Hashiana, Ana Hashem Hatzlichana, right? We're still in the midst of complicated times, and so we continue to pray for better times, and for improvements and for God's assistance. One of the things that I said in the past 2 years is that for every week that we said a mizmor of crisis and of pain and of sadness, I'd like to come back and say a mizmor of joy. And one of the beautiful things in the Mizmor Tehillim is that we have plentiful mizmorim that are both, right? Many of the mizmorim themselves are both, but also scattered throughout Sefer Tehillim, we have many mizmorim of joy. So we will continue with our minhag, with our tradition of opening always with a mizmor Tehillim, and I think it is appropriate today to open with a mizmor l'todah. So we'll open with Perek Kuf. Even while expressing that we know that there's still a long way to go, it is an opportunity to pause and express our gratitude for all the things that have been accomplished. Please feel free to say it along with me. Mizmor l'todah. Hariu l'Adonai kol haaretz. Ivdu et Adonai b'simcha, bo l'fanav birnana. Di'u ki Adonai hu Elohim. Hu asanu v'lo anachnu, amon v'tzon marito. Bo sha'arav b'todah, chatzerotav b'tihila, hodu lo baruchu shmo. Ki tov Adonai le'olam chasdo, ve'ad dor v'dor emunato. Okay, so now we will, I'm going to open with a bit of an introduction to this year's class. I want to talk about 2 things in our introduction, again, for the benefit of those who have been in the class, but perhaps especially for the benefit of the new students here, and I'm pleased to see everybody. I want to talk about two things. I want to talk a little bit about Sefer Bereshit, and I want to talk a little bit about where we are in the Yaakov stories. You know, the unique way that Sefer Bereshit tells stories, right? Especially in light of its place in the ancient Near East, right? It's worth noting what Bereshit is not before we note what it is, right? It's not a book of miracles. That's not the life that it's presenting to us. These are things that I think we take for granted. We all, we're somewhat familiar with the book of Bereshit. It's not a book of fantastic events. It's not a book that takes place in Shamayim, in the heavens, right? It's not a book in which divine secrets are being revealed, right? That's not what it is. And all of that is what we might expect, especially in light of some of the contemporary literature from the ancient Near East, right? Its events really take place on Earth, right? And it's about the here and now. It's not about the the end of days, right? What we're looking towards, right? It's the story of people, and that's extraordinary because that's, I think, a deep insight into what Judaism is, right? It's the story of humanity. We start out the first 11 chapters of the book. That's where we are right now in Shul, right, in the Parshiot HaShavua. It starts out with humanity in general, and it focuses on one family in particular. But it explores the purpose, the destiny of humans, the moral dilemmas, the tensions between humans, right? And of course, the possibility of human beings encountering God, right? There certainly is an element of connecting between the Shamayim and the Aretz, right? The heavens and the earth. That's part of the story, but the story is very much focused on people. Now, even while Bereshit focuses on people, it's not focused on kings, on the center of power, on empires, as many ancient myths do, right? It's not focused on the palace. It's focused on the home. It actually carries, I think, a distinctly anti-imperialistic tone, right? Certainly, if you look at Bereshit, Parak Yud Dalet, I mean, there are different places where you might see it in Bereshit, but Bereshit is not so interested in issues having to do with power. It's focused on the home, on interactions between regular human beings, right? Its dramas are less political and more moral, right? And that also, I think, is extraordinary. These are just things that I think we all know, right? But the minute you focus on it and you say it, you see how the ordinary is really extraordinary, right? It's about taking responsibility. It's about making hard choices. It's about forming faithful, trusting bonds. It's about the quest for human dignity. That's really what Sefer Bereshit is about. And Bereshit, unlike ancient Near Eastern myths, tells the story of ordinary people. That is, people that don't descend from gods, right? They don't aspire to be gods. They don't imagine attaining perfection, the perfection that is reserved for God, right? And they don't linger on, priests and prophets. We'll find that later in Tanakh, but that's not Sefer Bereshit, right? And Sefer Bereshit, I think, teaches us that the sacred, the worthy life, the virtuous life is not found only in prayer, in prophecy, in sacrifices, in service to God, but also in the everyday interactions between human beings, especially within the family. And that's a tough place to find it, because as we see in Sefer Bereshit, families are flawed. People are flawed. People are deeply flawed, right? Especially in their most elemental environment, right? And that's part of the story. And so because of the flaws of people, the story of Bereshit, I think it's a story that we find throughout the Tanakh. I mean, in the rest of the Tanakh, we do find focus on the palace, and we find focus on the Mikdash, on the sanctuary, on the temple, on the priests, on the prophets, on the rituals. That's also part of the story, right? But that's not the story of Sefer Bereshit. And Sefer Bereshit is the roots of it all, right? But because of these flaws, Sefer Bereshit is very focused on how we can correct ourselves, right? How we can make mistakes and bad decisions and come back from them and reinvent ourselves and reconstitute ourselves. You know, just as a thought experiment, I would just throw out there the question of what would happen. Just imagine if our vote looked very different. What were they doing all day? Well, they were perfect. They were performing miracles. They were engaged in communion with God all day long, sitting in their tents and praying. Right? What would our religion look like? Right? What would our lives look like? And instead, what we have, and this is one of the reasons that I'm very insistent on reading the pshat, right? Reading the simple meaning of the story. Instead, we have stories of people who are engaged in trying to be the best people that they can be, right? And they make mistakes, right? The stories are not there to not to prove divine perfection. That's not the goals of this story. It's certainly not to prove human perfection. That is definitely not the goals of the story. The stories are there to explore human imperfection. And it leaves questions open for us, for the reader, which is also, I think, a really important point because it takes the reader seriously. The reader being people who want to live their lives as Jews based on these stories, right? And it leaves questions open for us. It leaves us the ability to see not just what it means to encounter God in the best way, but also it leaves room for us to see what happens when things go wrong, right? And to explore this and to see humankind with all of their tensions and the moral life as a lived drama, right? It's not giving us settled doctrine, right? This is how you should do it. This is what's right. This is what's wrong. Don't do that, do that. Because that's just not the way life is, right? And so we often, as we read, begin to see the consequences of some of these choices. And we recognize that a lot of these choices have, even if they're the right choice, sometimes they still have negative consequences. And once one takes responsibility and makes those choices, one also has to live with those consequences. So these are some of the things that we've been talking about, those people who have been in my class for several years as we've been examining Sefer Bereshit. And these are some of the things that we'll be discussing this year as well. So that's a little bit of an introduction to Sefer Bereshit. It certainly is also part of, you know, as we read through these parshiot, right? We just began last week with Parshat Bereshit. And of course, you know, Parshat Bereshit starts with sin. It starts with human sin. It starts with human flaws, right? So this is really, I think, very relevant to our parshiot as well. Okay, now in terms of Yaakov, when we left off last year, it really was an optimal place to close the Yaakov story, right? We ended at the end of chapter 33. Yaakov had just returned from exile, right? We've talked a lot about, or we did talk a lot about Yaakov as the exile personality, right? As the one who represents how to survive in exile, what can happen in exile, how to return from exile, right? We see lots and lots and lots of midrashim and different biblical commentaries who talk about this aspect of Yaakov, who becomes sort of the paradigm of that figure. But by the end of our class last year, in chapter 33, we saw that he returned from exile. He returned from the house of Lavan, and the pasuk tells us he returns shalem, right? He returns whole. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about that. We're not going to engage in that kind of discussion, but we all know he actually doesn't return whole, certainly not shalem b'gufo, not whole in his body, and he's limping. But he's shalem, right? He's returned somehow a complete human being from this very challenging period in his life. And that, I think, is kind of a good closure for the Yaakov story. I mean, he went through a lot, right? What does the Malach tell him, right? Sarita in Elohim v'im anashim latucha. You struggled with God, you struggled with humans, and you overcame, right? That's the point that we find him. And this angel has just given him a new name. He is no longer that private person, Yaakov. He is now the national figure, Yisrael. He is going to be the father of Bnei Yisrael. He is no longer that Yaakov, that kind of twisted path of using deception in order to achieve your aims, right? Yaakov means something which is twisted. He is now Yisrael Yashar, right? The Haya Ha'akov Lamishor, right? The twisted becomes a straight path. So that's a really good kind of ending. I'd love it if it ended there, right? He prevails. He struggled. What does it mean? He struggled with humans, and he prevailed, right? Who did he struggle with? His two main struggles in life are with Esav and Lavan. And they each represent something. You know, Lavan, I think, represents the ethos of greed, right? And Yaakov emerges from Lavan's house with great wealth and with his children, both of which Lavan had laid claim to, right? So that struggle, throughout that struggle, or he emerges from that struggle having prevailed. And Esav really represents the emblem of power. He is the Ish Sadeh, right? And yet, at the end of chapter 33, Esav reconciles with Yaakov, and they each go their separate ways, right? On their path. There's certainly an agreement between them, right? So Yaakov seems to emerge from these difficult circumstances, these difficult situations, having prevailed. And the last thing that I'll say about where Yaakov is that when he returns, it seems as though he's returning to become one of the Avot, right? When he left, or at least before he left, he was just a private person, a simple tent dweller who functioned basically within the confines of the home. He doesn't do anything that seems to include him in the company of Abraham and Yitzchak. He doesn't even encounter God. It's only on his way out of Eretz Canaan that he encounters God, and he's told by God that you are part of the bigger picture, right? In other words, God gives him the bracha of Avram, right? God introduces himself in Perek Kafchet, where we began last year, right? In Perek Kafchet, in chapter 28, when Yaakov is on his way out, and God introduces himself as Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, and he tells him, you are going to have this land, lecha ulezarecha, right? Ufaratza yama v'kedma tzafona v'negba, right? He gives him the Avram bracha. You're going to get the land, you're going to get the children, right? And suddenly, Yaakov, on his way out, which is, I think, an extraordinary point, but we won't belabor the point because we talked about it last year. But on his way out of the land, he finds himself taking with him the bracha of Avram, which Avram got on his way into the land, right? But what happens to Yaakov when he returns is that his first two main actions at the end of chapter 33 are the primary activities that characterize the Avot, right? What does he do? He builds an altar and calls it with the name of God, right? If you look at the end of Bereshit Perek Lamed Gimel, right, which is right before the perek that we're planning to start with, right? So the very last pasuk of chapter 33, Vayatzev Sham Mizbeach, right? He sets up there an altar, Vayikra lo El Elohei Yisrael. He calls the altar God, the God of Israel. It's a little different than what Avram and Yitzchak do. Vayikra b'shem Hashem, right? He calls that, he uses the altar as kind of a taking off point to spread the name of God, which, by the way, ultimately is the essence of what we do when we get to the land of Israel, right? What's the goal of coming to the land of Israel? To make a mikdash. What is the mikdash? The mikdash is the place Asher Shem Hashem Nikra Alav, right? That's the place of where God's name rests on it. And Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah Udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. It's from that place that God's word goes out to the world. So Avram's acts, and we talk about this a lot, the acts of the forefathers are foreshadowing the goals of Am Yisrael. So when Avram comes into the land, and the first thing he does is he builds an altar and he calls on the name of God, that I think ultimately is certainly one of the major themes of Am Yisrael's goal in coming to the land of Israel. We come to the land of Israel with a responsibility. It's not just, oh, here's a gift, here's your homeland. Now, go do what you want there. Go raise your family and have a good life. No, it's now you're in the land where God rests his presence there. And from the land, you are meant to use the land of Israel as a place to spread the idea of God, right? It's not coincidental that the land of Israel is chosen because it is situated between the two great ancient superpowers, Mesopotamia and Egypt. Anyone who wants to go from Mesopotamia to Egypt has to walk through the land of Canaan, or the opposite, right? And therefore, of course, the idea is that Am Yisrael has a lot of contact with different peoples, right? Today, and of course, thank God, nobody is coming from Mesopotamia and walking through the land of Israel to get to Egypt, right? But I think the equivalent of this today is that, somehow our story finds its way on the front page of the paper every single day. And I don't just mean in the last 2 years, it's always been that way. So somehow the world seems unduly fixated on what is going on in Israel. Maybe I shouldn't say unduly. I should say divine providence has made it that everyone's fixated on Israel. And so from there, we spread the idea of God, right? So Yaakov's first task when he comes to the land, when he finds himself now settled in the land, he does two things that remind us certainly of Avram, but in general of the story of the Avot, and that is to build a mizbeach, an altar, to call on it in the name of God. And the other thing he does is he buys a piece of land, right? Also very, very, very significant. Okay, so this is just a great kind of ending for the Yaakov story. Wouldn't it be great if he could just now go on in peace for the rest of his life? And that is, of course, not going to happen, right? Yaakov still has a lot of challenges ahead, right? He's returned to Canaan. Now, how does he interact with the people of Canaan? He's going to find some Lavans there, and he's going to find some Esavs there, right? That's this story. I mean, it's the story of greed, and it's the story of violence. And so he's still contending with Lavan and Esav. But the other challenge, look, there is a challenge also of returning to his father, fulfilling his vow, coming back to the land, and making sure that everything that he had intended actually happens. He doesn't get back to his father right away, which is itself rather curious. And he doesn't fulfill his vow that he made on his way out right away. A lot of the Parshanim, a lot of the commentaries are going to discuss that. We'll get to that. But his other challenge is passing on his values downward, right, to his children, right? So, and of course, not just passing on values, but also creating a family between them, unity, right? This is the next challenge in Yaakov's life. And I will say that, at this moment when rest and reward are just within reach, that's when everything falls apart. It falls apart in the next generation, right? Or it seems to fall apart, right? Look at the Ibn Ezra in source number 2. Look at the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra on the words Vayavo Yaakov Shalem, right? Yaakov comes whole. And so the Ibn Ezra says here, Shem Tar. The word Shalem is an adjective, right? Because there are some Parshanim who say Shalem is the name of the place. Right now, the Ibn Ezra, I explained it the way the Ibn Ezra explained it. I said you don't actually need that because that's, I think, the most basic understanding of the word shalom. But then he goes on and he says, Shabbat shalom, he came in peace. Nothing happened to him. Ki ata yachel lesaper me'ura dina. But now we are going to tell the story of what happened to Dina, right? So the Ibn Ezra here, I think, really kind of notes the irony or the kind of the sudden crash, right, in Yaakov's life. Yaakov has a hard life, right? And even when we think that he's come back and kind of can now rest after all of these trials and tribulations, after having emerged shalem from these trials and tribulations, in fact, we see that things really seem to begin to be calamitous, right? It's not just the story of Dinah, of course. After that, it's the story of Yosef and eventually the descent to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, right? That's a hard story. Tamar, there's lots of chairs here if you'd like to sit.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so Perek Lamed Daled, as I said, is the book where we turn to the next generation, right? And Yaakov's children really are take on the main role in this story. They're the main figures of the story. If you ask me, what this story is about, I mean, I called it Dina in Shem. That might not be a great title, but I needed to give Dina a little bit of attention because she doesn't get. I wanted to give her proper place, right? But if you'd ask me who are the main figures of the story, it's Shimon and Levi, probably, right? Or certainly the sons of Yaakov, right? Yaakov is very much receding in this story as leader, as decision maker, as the arbiter of morality, right? Yaakov has very much receded. And instead what we have is the passing on of the baton to the next generation, which obviously is very, very difficult and very complicated. And I don't think that there's a parent here that doesn't identify with that sentence, right? It's a hard thing to do. But it's not just Yaakov that's featured passing on the story to the next generation. You'll know as we begin to examine the story that the same kind of dynamic seems to be going on between Hamor and Shem, right? Again, there's a father and a son where we're going to see, sometimes the father's speaking and the son interrupts. And then we're going to see the same thing happen with Yaakov and the sons of Yaakov, right? So there's kind of a story here to see how Yaakov's sons are going to work with other sons, right? The sons of the Canaanites, right? Some of the, as I said, the story of Shem is also the story of encountering Lavan and Esav again. But again, this time it's the sons encountering Lavan and Esav, and that's also encountering greed, encountering violence. That's also an important point to make. The last point I want to make about what happens in this next generation is, if you look at the story, there do seem to be a lot of connections between this story and the story of Sarah being taken by, well, twice happens with Sarah, right? She's taken by Paro and she's taken by Avimelech, right? Once in Perek Yud Bet and once in Perek Kaf, chapters 12 and 20, right? So this story seems to connect to that story, right? We have two stories where a woman is taken against her will, from the bosom of her family into the home of a leader. And the story, if we focus specifically on Avimelech's story, the story continues with collective punishment, right? It's one leader that takes her in, but everybody is punished, right? So there is a certain kind of continuity in the theme of this story, and one of I think the conclusions that we draw and that we will continue to draw from the story is the absolute immoral cultural mores that are going on in Canaan. All of this is showing us, first of all, what kinds of attitudes and values prevail in Canaan, with an eye towards understanding why Canaan has been slated for destruction. Not just destruction, but replacement. And also, and perhaps even more importantly, showing us what kinds of values are abhorrent and cannot be part of the Jewish people. Because if they are, then the same thing will happen to Am Yisrael that happened to Canaan, right? And that's Vayikra, chapters 18 and 20, right? Where God says, Kimase Eretz Canaan, Kimase Eretz Mitzrayim, Lo Ta'asu. Don't do what the people of Canaan and what the people of Egypt did. And what follows is a list of sexual immorality. And what happens in Sefer Bereshit is a lot of sexual immorality, right? So we're seeing that pattern again. We saw it with Sodom as well. You see it in a lot of stories in Sefer Bereshit. I mean, it's sort of the almost dominant theme of Sefer Bereshit. You don't see the Canaanites worshiping idols, right? That's not really the theme. The theme is sexual immorality, which of course is connected to worshiping idols, of course, right? Monotheism and monogamy, polytheism and polygamy, right? This notion of sexual fidelity is easily transferred to fidelity to God, right? So, but this sexual immorality that prevails in Sefer Bereshit also represents, I think, the continuity of the story. But there is one very big difference, and that's what I mean. There are several big differences. One of which, of course, is that Dinah is not married, right? She's not, she's not an Isha Ish, so that's obviously a difference. And that difference, I'll get back to that difference in a minute. But the other main difference, which I think is really important for understanding what's happening in this next generation of Yaakov, is that God doesn't intervene to save her. Right? God doesn't intervene to save Dinah. Now, he does intervene to save Sarah, right? Or Sarai, depending on which story, right? But so the Bnei Yaakov have a dilemma. What do we do? When God's not intervening, what do we do? Hachizonah said the chotet, right? I mean, she's there in the palace. Shem, seems to love her, right? And really does. But of course, he's violated her, of course. But that seems to be pretty okay in that world, right? We're going to see that. We're going to talk about it. But I think it's the choices that they have. The Bnei Yaakov. Also, she's not married. They have a choice here, and this leads me to one of the big themes of this upcoming story, and that is the question of separation versus integration, right? To what degree does Avram integrate into the land? And to what degree does he remain separate, right? I think that's one of the defining features of the difference between Avram and Lot, right? Lot says, okay, you know what? I'm going to go live with the people of Shem. Vayahal at Shem, right? I'm sorry, Stone, right? I'm going to go live with the people of Vayahal at Stone, right? And Avram gets up and leaves. Ger v'toshav anochi imachem, right? I'm a stranger amongst you. I'm not part of you. On the other hand, there are interactions. So it's one of the really important questions in this story, in the story of Dinah and Shem, because they have a choice, the sons. They're given a choice. Let's marry each other. We'll have commercial partnership and cooperation, and you can live amongst us, and we'll all be one big happy family, right? And that choice is very much part of the story of the next generation, right? The children of Yaakov. By the way, the name of God never appears in this whole chapter. It's interesting, right? God has kind of withdrawn from this story and given the decision making to the family, and it's a really complicated story, which we'll see in a minute. A couple other things I want to say about this story is, first of all, this is Am Yisrael's first war, right? This is the first war of Am Yisrael, war for war against the city in Canaan. We have Avram, of course, going to rescue Lot from the 4 kings, right? But this is the first war. In fact, it's considered to be, to some degree, and again, we'll talk about this as well, kind of the paradigm for kibush haaretz. In the book of Yoshua, there are some very important references to this story, which is what we would expect, right? Because if this story is kind of the launching pad or the foundation or the paradigm of the kibush haaretz story, conquest of the land. Again, kibush haaretz, which emerges from sexual violence and immorality, not from a quest to plunder the city. Right, one of the moral dilemmas happens when they plunder the city. Right, a lot of the Parshanim are really upset there, and maybe that's also what gets Yaakov upset. But there are some really kind of delicate movements that we're going to have to make throughout this story, because a lot of things are left unclear. And the other theme that I want to mention at the outset, even though it's not obvious, but it's one that I think is really important, is that throughout this story, we also I mentioned we have kind of like these Esav-like references. But I think one of the themes of the story, and it's not me that thinks this, I mean, I really got this from who's one of my favorite Parshans, for those of you, Rashar Hirsch, right? We're going to see a lot of Rashar Hirsch. He's your first source on the source sheet. I think he has a lot of deep insights. Again, into human behavior and especially in Sefer Bereshit. And he has this understanding of this story, that the story is about not becoming like Esav. He says, look at where the story takes place. This story takes place just after we have separated from Esav. And we've said, Esav strides along with his confident path, and Yaakov goes limping away, right? And that's an important distinction. We walk through life with a little bit of a limp. That Rashar Hirsch sees that's an ethos of the Jewish people, right? And that there's a real danger in becoming Esav-like, especially when we're forced into battle. Now, if this sounds like I'm talking about contemporary events, of course I'm not, right? But all of Tanakh is. Look, I mean, it always is talking about contemporary events, but I would say in the past 100 years, the Tanakh talks to us differently. And I would definitely say in the last 2 years, the Tanakh talks to us differently. So, I mean, some people have been in my class for a long time. A few people commented to me last year, you never used to talk about like contemporary events. I'm not talking about it, the Tanakh is talking about it, right? So certainly I think we're going to see in this story, I mean, Dina getting taken hostage, there's just so many things going on. The question of collateral damage in warfare, collective punishment, what happens to innocent people. I mean, there are some really, really big moral dilemmas that are going to come up in this chapter. And the moral dilemmas are on both sides of the equation, right? Whatever your politics are. Both sides of the political spectrum, I think, come to the fore in this chapter, right? How are we meant to feel about the behavior of Shimon and Levi, or Yaakov's sons in general? How do we feel about deception? Using deception. How do we feel about using circumcision in deception? That's a big one, right? How do we feel, of course, about killing an entire city? What does it mean that they're all culpable? Are they all culpable, right? Well, I don't understand the plundering of the city. The flip side, of course, is Yaakov, his silence, his passivity in the wake of Dina being violated, right? He doesn't do anything. He waits. He doesn't talk. He doesn't even express anger or outrage. Right? There's something about Yaakov's behavior is so troubling, and ultimately, Yaakov's behavior suggests. This is what some of the midrashim are going to say, that Dam Yehudi Hefker, the blood of Am Yisrael is Hefker. How do you say Hefker in English? What? It's cheap, okay, it's cheap, yeah. Right? Hafizonaya said that Chotenu are the last words in the book, in the story. The story ends with a rhetorical question. You're going to make our sister like a prostitute? You're going to treat her as if she has no worth, no value? You know, how do we balance strength with moral purity? That's really what's underlying this question. There's not a clear answer, right? You know, more importantly, how do we stay true to who we want to be, right? To our virtuous and gentle goals. I mean, the Torah, if nothing else, has as its core the value of human life, human dignity, right? We just read it in last week's parsha, right? The central core of the Tanakh is the value of human beings. So how do we maintain that when we are forced into war? Right? Okay.
And what does Dinah want?
Dinah is not so much factored in here. She is the yeah, but again, I mean, not the object, because the Tanakh doesn't care about her, the opposite, right? Look, I mean, I won't go too contemporary with this, but that, I mean, you know, the obvious question is that who's making the decisions here? Not Dinah. She's in the palace where she doesn't have a say in this discussion, right? And I guess the other question, and again, all these questions we're going to address. I'm not saying we're going to come out with a clear answer. In fact, I'm saying exactly the opposite. We are never going to come out with a clear answer. If we had a clear answer, the last 2 years wouldn't have been so difficult, even within ourselves, right? One of the more important questions is, what happens to Shimon and Levi as a result of this story? Who do they become? Who do we become when we are at war? When we emerge from war? When we're forced to go to war? When we know we have to go to war, but we would rather be in university, right? And these are really important questions. Okay, yeah, I know that I keep trying to stay away, but I can't stay away from it. Look, moral dilemmas are not particular to this chapter. They are at the heart of Sefer Bereshit, and they are wonderful because they're what makes us human, and they are hard, and they are what makes our lives as humans hard. Look, I'm going to just sort of summarize what some of the ways that the text approaches this story, the Dinah, the Shimon and Levi story in particular. I'm just going to throw out a few things. I made a little chart for myself, just to kind of make Seder, because I want to know, what is the text telling us? What can I glean from the chapter that can lead me either to say Shimon and Levi were justified, or Shimon and Levi are very problematic, and you're going to see a lot of machloket about this among the Parshanim, or more likely to say, in this way, Shimon and Levi were justified, and in this way, they were problematic, right? So that's what I'm really looking for, because, a clear-cut answer we're not going to emerge with. But what are some of the clues in the text? So first of all, who gets the last word in the story? Okay, so you think it's Shimon and Levi, because if you go to the last pasuk, Hachizonaya said Tachotenu, that's the brothers, right? That's Shimon and Levi. But who really has the last word? Yaakov, of course, in his deathbed blessings, if you call them blessings, right? Where he condemns Shimon and Levi, and he punishes them. Now, Arura Pam Ki Az, right? Evratam Ki Azata, right? He's cursing their anger. Okay, you could do a lot with that, right? You could say, well, he's cursing their anger. He's not cursing what they did. He's cursing the way that they did. You could do a lot, right? But at the same time, there's kind of both parties get the last word, right? I don't get to hear Yaakov's last word until Perek Mem 10. That's a lot of prakim that Shimon and Levi sit with me. And that's important, right? I feel at the end of this story that Shimon and Levi are given the last word. And it's only much later that I hear that it's been brewing with Yaakov, and that Yaakov, in his final assessment, goes back to this story. By the way, some of the Midrashim suggest that Yaakov's deathbed blessings are not about this story. They're about the selling of Yosef. Why do they say that? Because they want to remain with a sense that this story was in fact justified. But there's so much machloket about this, right? We're not going to see anything that everybody agrees on. Okay, that's just to give you a heads up. Okay, so the last word of the story. Shimon and Levi remain part of Avram's family. They don't get kicked out. On the other hand, they don't get a nachala. Okay, so punishment or reward? You know, even when Yaakov expresses his displeasure at the end of the story, he does so not on moral grounds, but on pragmatic ones, right? He says, "Oh, you've endangered me, right, among the people who live here." That's what he says in the second to last pasuk. So that itself is worthy of note. And Yaakov's fears that they've endangered him actually don't come true. So maybe Yaakov is wrong, right? There's a lot of clues going on here, aside from the actual events. Actually what is done. An entire city is massacred. They use deception. They use circumcision. All the things that we noted before that, they plunder the city. All these things that leave us a little bit uncomfortable or with questions. Aside from all of that, which, you could debate on both sides kind of endlessly, right? There are little clues in the story that take us in both directions. So what have we accomplished? Nothing. I mean, in terms of really being able to conclude, but get ready for that, right? That's our study of Sefer Bereshit, and it is what Sefer Bereshit is trying to teach us, right? This is our journey. Our journey is one which is filled with ambiguity and complexity. And okay, that's true about life, right? That's one of the things I love about Tanakh, is that the Tanakh reflects life. It doesn't reflect some kind of perfect platonic ideal. Okay, by way of introduction, I want to turn our attention to Rashar Hirsch. Now, one of the things, for those people who have not been in the class, we do use a lot of parshanut, especially those parshanim that I consider to be very, very wonderful, particularly in Sefer Bereshit. Right? If we were in a different book, I might turn more to other parshanim, but I do try to look at an overview of the parshanim. I don't bring all the parshanim, but I do try to offer a representative view of what different commentators are saying, especially when they're in disagreement with each other. But Rashar Hirsch, as I said, he gets a special place in this class. Let's look at his comment here in source number 1, and it's kind of a summary comment of this event.
Who translated?
Who translated it?
Did you go in German?
Yeah, I took it from the Al HaTorah website, so I assume they would know, but I don't know. It probably says it on the website. Okay, look at what he says. From this event, which is the first conflict with another nation, the family of Yaakov learns a very important lesson. Because they are weak and unprotected. And as I said before, Rashar Hirsch sees this as the right way for Am Yisrael to be, right? Not necessarily that he would say we don't need an army, or that's not what he said. That we're somehow slated to be smaller and at a disadvantage within the world. We're that levadad yishkon, and he makes an ethic out of it. The only time that we can actually be confident, given our disadvantage, is when the world recognizes our moral and spiritual nobility. Right? That's part of the goal of Am Yisrael, is to present ourselves to the world as having this nobility, so that people in the world will appreciate it. Asher ba dafka b'chulshatam hagashmit הם מגלים את הכוח האלוקי המנצח שעושה את יעקב לישראל. So that specifically in their material weakness, in their physical disadvantage, the world will see that God is helping Am Yisrael, that God is steering Am Yisrael. Ach kan. But here, now he's trying to account for these acts of violence, which in his mind is not the essence of Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael for Rosh Hashanah is meant to kind of go along its path and, to create kind of an aura around them where they will remain secure, not by virtue of their strength, of their physical strength, of their numbers, but by virtue of the messages that they're giving to the world. But look at what he says here. The human dignity of Israel has been desecrated. Naastabo nivala, right? It's become despised and scorned. Bitnaim acherim, davar kazeh, leolam lo yaseh. In other circumstances, this thing, meaning the violence that is done against this young girl, Dinah, would never have been done. Shechem lo haya me'ez la'asot zo lebito shel ezrach min haminyan. Shechem would never have done this to a full citizen of the country. הדבר נעשה לדינה רק משום שהייתה בת יעקב, אינה אלא נערה יהודייה. Of course, we have to understand that Rosh Hashanah is talking from 19th century Germany, where he felt very comfortable, by the way. But at the same time, there's a long history of mistreatment of Jews as Jews in Europe. One of the, I think, sort of uncomfortable things that I often encounter, I think some of us have seen it together before, in Rosh Hashanah is that he oftentimes praises Germany as the new enlightened place where Jews can thrive and flourish for days to come, right? Of course, he dies in 1880s, right, in Germany, so long before the Nazis came to power, and when Enlightenment and, the opening of the universities to Jews was really very much a chiddush. In any case, here he says, look, this is not a regular incident. This is an incident where human dignity has been desecrated as a result of her being part of Am Yisrael. This thing deeply influences the sons of Yaakov. He says, even if before they understood that what he calls the Gid ha'alicha hayitziva, which is of course a reference to the Gid hanashet, right? So he says, basically what he means here is, you have to go back and read what he said there, but what he means here is that confident, forward, bold stride through the world. That's not for Am Yisrael. That's not for Am Yisrael, he says, right? He says, even though before, by getting that blow, they understood that they were meant to take a little bit of a more hesitant, kind of limping approach, he said, here, achata, huvrar lahem shekayamim matzavim, שבהם ירצו יותר לקחת לידיהם את חרבו של עשיו. They here understand that there are circumstances where they have to take up the sword of Esav. What are those circumstances? When dignity has been desecrated, when Am Yisrael has been mistreated, because they are Am Yisrael and they do have the values of human dignity that are both our strength, but can also be exploited by our enemies as weakness. When what is in balance is keeping purity and morality, then they have to take up the sword. Okay, so here we see, I think, really Rashar Hirsch kind of very much showing his approach. It's not necessarily everybody's approach, but his approach to, in general, what Am Yisrael is meant to be, again, certainly coming from his perspective, but at the same time, also recognizing that circumstances sometimes require Am Yisrael to take up the sword, but not just any sword. What does he call it? The sword of Esav. sometimes we have to be ace-like. This is important. We're gonna come back to this point, right? Being ace-like. Okay, let's look at before we open the Dinah story, which won't be today, but it will be Be'ezrat Hashem next time. But before we open the Dinah story, yeah.
Can I just, I respect what he says here. I don't think it's true. I think that Shem would have taken any woman he wanted.
Yeah.
He might have weighed exactly who he was taking, whether they were warlike enough to attack him, and that might have been part of this here. But that time, in that kind of a situation, I think Shem was it.
Yeah, Janice is saying something important. I'll just repeat it for the benefit of Zoom, which is that, it may not be true about Shem, that Shem only attacks Dinah because she is, part of Am Yisrael. In fact, I think that we're going to see clues to that as well, which is why it is important for me to see Rasha Hirsch within his context. In his context, it is true that people were behaving in Europe in a different way with their Christian neighbors and with Am Yisrael. And so he sees this story through the prism of his reality. It still is an important point that he's making, which is that there are times, especially when you feel that the violence that has been done impugns not just purity and morality in general, but the way that people treat Am Yisrael in particular, that in those cases, taking up arms is called for, even if arms are not the natural state of Am Yisrael, right? Okay, maybe one could even extrapolate from this to, larger questions about Medina Yisrael. Yeah.
Back to Israel, to Canaan, I mean, that was the way of the
Yeah,
world.
absolutely.
In Europe in the Middle Ages was that if you were
That's true.
the king, you could.
In certain places in Europe, the king had discretion, sexual discretion with all, or not even the king, the count of the region. Yeah, okay, but there is no doubt that Jews were treated differently in Europe, in terms of violence and mistreatment. But you're right there. I definitely agree with you that in this story, what's being reflected is a certain kind of cultural approach, which is heinous and needs to be uprooted. That's what I was saying also before. So your point is well taken. Okay, but before we start the Dinah story, I want to look at the last few psukim of chapter 33 to look at it inside, see what we can understand from these psukim that kind of give us a little bit of a sense of some of the themes that are going to come up in the Dinah story. Let's look in pasuk Yud-Chet, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem. I'm in chapter 33, verse 18, Perek Lamed Gimel, pasuk Yud-Chet. Vayavo Yaakov Shalem ir Shechem asher be'eretz Canaan v'vo mipadan Aram vayichan et pnei ha'ir. Okay, so Yaakov comes back Shalem, whole, to the city of Shechem, which is in Canaan, when he's coming back from Padan Aram. And the next words are interesting. Vayichan et pnei ha'ir. He encamps against the city, across from the city, not in the city, right? Facing the city. Yeah, he doesn't go into the city. That itself is interesting, right? And that sort of puts him on Avram's side, right? Avram also doesn't go into the city of Shechem, right? He builds a mizbeach and then he moves on, right? So let's look at the next few psukim. Vayiken et chelkat hasadah asher natasham oalo miad bnei chamor avi Shechem, and he buys that portion of the field where he had placed his tent. Remember that he is a tent person, right? He's Ishtan Yoshev Alim. He buys it from the sons of Chamor, the father of Shem, b'mea ksita, for 100 ksita. We don't know exactly how much that is, but it's a sum of money. Vayatzav sham mizbeach vayikra lo el Elohei Yisrael. Oh, we saw that already.
First he camps and then he faces.
Yeah, it seems, then he wants to own it. It seems to be a sadeh, which is open, and now he says, I want to own it. What we didn't say was that in Pasuk Yud Zayin, he built a house, which is also interesting.
They buy a plot of land and then put a tent on it.
Yeah, okay, you're right.
Yeah.
There is something interesting about that.
Yeah.
I want to, for a moment, focus on the words Vayichan et pnei ha'ir. And the reason I want to focus on these words is because, first of all, because the Midrash focuses on these words, And I want to give you a little bit of a sense of how we will be dealing with Midrash in this class. For those of you who have learned with me, you know I love the Midrashim. And I love the Midrashim because I think they often reflect the Omek Pshuto Shel Mikra, the deep underlying themes of the text. Even while they seem to, kind of float away on their own, in their own path, I think if we bring them back, we see that they're really contending with the real questions. So this is, I think, how we're going to close our class today, is with this Midrash in source number 3. Let's see what the Midrash says. Now, what I really want to see in this Midrash is that this Midrash is dealing with the question of how Yaakov approaches his Canaanite neighbors. Vayichan et pnei ha'ir, right? We already said he doesn't go into the city, but what does exactly this mean? It's such an odd formulation. Vayichan et pnei ha'ir, he encamps across the city or facing the city, Elaine said, right? Looks odd. Yeah, I mean, it could say a lot of things, right? But this is an odd formulation, and it draws the attention of the Midrash. But the Midrash uses this question to address, I think, its real topic, which is, to what degree does Yaakov integrate within his surroundings? And that's, of course, a machloket. Okay, so let's read through the Midrash, and then we'll try to offer an analysis of it. There are 3 opinions. Vayichan et pnei ha'ir, chanan et hapanim sheba'ir. You see that? Et hapanim sheba'ir means the dignitaries, right? He gives favor to the dignitaries in the city. Hitchil mishalech lahem doronot. He started sending them gifts. Okay, that's the first explanation. Davar acher, vayichan et pnei ha'ir, hitchil ma'amid hatlisin umocher bezot. He set up bazaars so that we could sell cheap merchandise. Right? It's shuk ramla. Hadamar ch'adam tzarich lachzik tova l'makom sheyesh lo hana mimenu. What do we learn from this? That you have to benefit the place that you are living there. Third explanation.
What's Tlisin?
Tlisin is like some kind of bazaars, some kind of shuk. Vayichan et pnei ha'ir, nichnas be'erev Shabbat im dimdumei chama mi be'od yom. He came erev Shabbat as the sun was setting. What's the word vayichan? V'kava techumin mi be'od yom. That's pretty far from the pshat, right? And he made a tchum Shabbos. Hada marcha shamar Yaakov et Shabbat kodem shenitan. From here we learn that Yaakov kept Shabbat even before it was given. Well, I don't know, Shabbat's an easy one because we have that in Bereshit Perek. Okay, so even before we have the Tchum Shabbos, Yaakov already has those details. Okay, how are we meant to understand these explanations? The first 2 explanations relate to the socioeconomic realm, right? And the third one to the religious one, okay? The first explanation has Yaakov being very, I think, diplomatic, right? And it reminds us of what? He's sending gifts to the dignitaries. Esav, of course, right? What are we learning here? We're learning the nature of Yaakov's relationship with Shem is cautious, distant, maybe deferential a little bit, right? A lot, right? He's sending gifts. He's trying to pacify them. This is well learned from his encounter with the hostile Esav. The assumption is hostility. The assumption is that there's suspicion between people, and therefore he pacifies them as he approaches the city. Okay, that's the first. The second, I think the second one is wonderful, right? Also in the commercial realm, but here he's not differential, right? What is he doing? He's gifting the world around him with commercial success. Sound like any Jews you know, right? Okay, that's it's part of the story of the Avot, right? We see it, and it's part of the story of Tanakh, right? Where Yaakov comes to Lavan's house, he brings blessing. Yitzchak also brings blessing during a time of Ra'av, right? He's creating success in his environment, right? Apparently Jews have always been resourceful in that way, right? So that's part of the story. And part of the story, I think, is telling us that wherever we go, we are meant to create a cooperative, beneficial relationship with those around us. We're meant to use our abilities to help the world, to make the world a more dignified place, a place that is a better place to live. That's part of the story, right? Very different than the first one, but also within the realm of monetary success. By the way, I brought for you in source 4 a similar idea. And there's my alarm. That means I have a few more minutes. Okay, I brought for you a similar idea in source number 4, where the Gemara in Shabbos also takes these words and talks about all of the different benefits that Yaakov brought to Shem, to the world in which he was. But maybe the most interesting one is the third one. Because in the spiritual realm, what is Yaakov doing? He's setting up boundaries, right? The Tom Shabbat is our boundaries, right? So, he arrives just before Shabbat and he marks the boundaries of his territory. This is us, this is them, right? In the spiritual realm, there isn't any sort of partnership. See what this midrash did? It's a remarkable midrash. I'm not even sure if it doesn't seem to me to be a machloket. It's not a debate. It's not people disagreeing with each other. These are 3 aspects of the way that Am Yisrael interacts with the world around them. We always have an assumption of hostility. We always want to benefit the world, and we always want to maintain a distinctness in terms of our religious obligations. And that's the way we read Midrash, right? The Midrashim here are coming to tell us much deeper things than what do the words mean, because the words don't really mean any of those things, right? Okay, so on that note, I will wish you all a good week, a good continued week, a good Shabbat. As Hashem will meet here next Wednesday. I will say one last point, which is that because this class is in an auditorium and because of its size, we don't usually have a lot of occasion for questions and for comments in the middle of class. Sometimes, there's necessary clarifications, or if ever there's that sort of question, I do encourage you to ask in the middle of class. But this is the time that if people do have questions or comments, sometimes there'll be a few minutes at the end of class, not so often. But if anybody wants to come forward and or ask them there, Abby.
Found it interesting that on number 2, that they set up, the whole commercial thing, that then receives it as a positive, whereas that's the biggest anti-Semitic trope.
It's
getting money.
So Abby, I would only say it's not the biggest anti-Semitic trope. It's when we're poor, then that's the biggest anti-Semitic trope. But you're right. Today that certainly is. But yes. Yeah. Okay.
When he talks about how there's simply struggling with that is wanting to find something like go donkey's market.
Right.
And meet stuff. And I have to struggle with special is able to let him go.
Yeah.
And be truly aggressive.
Yeah.
And I think that's just the same this. I don't know if that is another makes sense. But I think it really melts.
Yeah. You know who else goes to